Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Alison Furneaux, and I'm the CMO of CyberSaint. Today, we're going to be talking about what C-suite executives and boards should be having as top of mind this year as it pertains to cybersecurity. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Homaira Akbari, President and CEO of Acknowledged Partners, LLC, a global strategy advisory firm providing services to leading private equity funds and large corporations in the sectors of IoT, cybersecurity, AI, and fintech. She has a long track record of serving on both nonprofit, public, and private boards, including Banco Santander, Temenos, and Landstar System. Homaira has also held senior management roles in multiple Fortune 1000 companies. She holds a PhD with honors from Tufts University, an MBA from Carnegie Mellon, and she's the author of more than 50 scientific articles in international journals, holds 2 patents, and is a frequent speaker at cybersecurity conferences around the world. She also has published numerous governance and technology op-eds and is a frequent guest on podcasts. So we are very excited to have Homaira here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
So let's kick it off and talk a little bit about cybersecurity concerns for 2022. Going into 2022, obviously, we've seen a lot of disruption from a war in Ukraine to skyrocketing ransomware attacks. What questions are boards of directors and C-level executives asking of their CISOs at this time?
Well, the questions remain very similar to what they would have asked without Ukraine war, but obviously with Ukraine war, it is even more questions. But some of the questions that have already been percolating since last year is ransomware specifically, and what is our ransomware policy? So it's one of the things that either companies addressed it already last year or they're in process it. But those are one of the big questions that in every board I have been this year so far. We have discussed ransomware policy specifically, and the process also. When it happens, what process do they go through to? Outside of that, depending where you are, whether you're in the US or whether you're in Europe or elsewhere in the world, and whether and which industry you're part of, you could ask many questions about Ukraine wars. One of the beliefs today is that Russia is currently very focused on Ukraine and disruptions and a lot of cyber attack on Ukraine in addition to physical attack. But the belief is that Russia, they're looking for the right moment, and this is not right now the right moment for them just because of their focus area, to actually attack Western, US-based and European-based companies, enterprises, or systems and infrastructures. As part of that, due to the fact that there has been a lot of sanctions, especially on the financial institutions of in Russia, the belief is that there may be an attack on SWIFT. The banks themselves, both in Europe and in the US and elsewhere, are pretty hardened, so they have pretty good cyber defenses, but SWIFT itself has less cyber defense.
And, thinking about ransomware and then, the threat from the war, what are the top cyber risks that boards and C-suite executives are most concerned about right now when it comes to those 2 areas or beyond?
Right. So outside of ransomware, which we discussed, which is really, part of it is because of the surge. We saw Colonial Pipeline and other situations, but, based on the research which was done, there was like almost a 300% increase in ransom attacks, and with that being a huge, like almost 800% on government and state and local governments specifically, and something like even as high, like 1,000 times on healthcare, which I'm sure a lot of cases that you heard last year, specifically last year, but it continues into this year. Other areas, look, boards are always continuing to be very concerned about just traditional posture, what we call traditional, which is even email security, identification, management, authentication, web services. So the boards, do ask questions specifically on those areas, but some of the more I don't want to say new because they're not quite new, but they are becoming more important, are cloud and SaaS. And the reason for that is because of what happened during pandemic, because of remote working, and then there's acceleration into cloud, migration to cloud, and also even companies like SAP, think about it, they're primarily on-prem company, and they said, we're going to transform our business to SaaS. So even very sophisticated technology software companies are using SaaS and cloud a lot more than before. So there's whole boards have been like, it's been good 2 or 3 years, but it's even more accelerated now to talk about what about our security there. And specifically when it comes to SaaS is, where's my data? Where does it sit? How does it flow? So that data security within SaaS is quite important. Other areas are third-party security always remains important, especially what happened with SolarWinds, and how do I protect my software? And finally, one of the things that it's becoming, this is more for sophisticated enterprises, I wouldn't say SMEs are still looking at this, is really looking at our strategy, at the company's strategy, and then say, what is, against that strategy, your business strategy, what's my cyber strategy and my cyber roadmap? And threat modeling, for example, is an area that a lot of people are starting to work heavily on.
Yeah, and to your point about maturity, right? The maturity of an organization isn't necessarily correlated with the size of the organization, but you do sit on multiple boards, public and private. How is the issue of cybersecurity handled differently on a public board versus a private board? Is there a massive, disparity in maturity there, or what do you see?
The short answer is yes. There is less maturity in private companies. Having said that, it depends. If you're a private company and, for example, you're serving government entities or financial institutions, then you have just as much maturity. But looking overall, for example, there was a survey, and something like 56% of small, not medium is much more mature, small businesses said they don't really care for cybersecurity, and 24% said they don't know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So that gives you almost 80%, or like nearly 80% of the small businesses, which are defined and less than 100, or even 70 employees. So one of the things is that with public boards, there are several things happening. One is obviously, if you're a public board and you have a breach, you have to report that, and that's quite embarrassment. Mm-hmm. But also, SEC is coming up with a way of disclosing all of your cyber health, and obviously also breaches, which has been in place a good almost 10 years now. And then if you're in a regulated industry, like financial institutions, or you're a vendor to those regulated industries, even if you're not in regulated industry, but you're a public company and you're serving regulated industries, then you have to not only you have to disclose your cyber posture, but also you get heavily penalized for not doing the right things. So I would say yes, there's a big difference, but I see a world that we would have even for small businesses, because this is what we saw, for example, years ago, back in almost 2013 or 14, when Target was attacked. It was a tiny HVAC contractor which caused the attack on Target. Mm-hmm. Target eventually came out of that much stronger, but still it was a pretty serious incident. So I think I see the world as such that all of these companies, whether they're public, private, not-for-profit, small, large, have to have some level of cyber posture.
And you talked earlier about aligning the business strategy to the cybersecurity strategy. And the way that we see the world over here at CyberSaint is we see the world in terms of risk, right? And cyber risk management. So that's a big component when you're aligning business and cyber, is looking at it through the lens of risk. How do you think cyber risk management needs to be handled in the boardroom, and how have you seen it come to the forefront over the last 5 or 10 years?
Quite interesting question. So I got on my first public board back in 2013. Fast forward, I've now served on 7, 8 public boards, not all simultaneously. Today, I only serve on 3 of them. But I've served on large, small, technology, infrastructure, and financial services, logistics. And the reality is, back in 2013, maturity of all these companies when it came to cybersecurity was very low. And then fast forward, today it's very high. And so we went from not talking about cybersecurity at all, really at all, to in majority of these companies, to now talking to them minimum in the boardroom, minimum of 2 times. And that's kind of unusual. It's more 4 to 10 times when you include committee discussions. For example, cybersecurity does get discussed in audit committee because it's part of that, or if the company has also risk committee, it gets discussed in risk committee as well. So when you multiply those numbers, you sort of get like somewhere for a public company, somewhere between 4 to 12 times, if not even more, I would say. So that's quite interesting. Now, back again, in 5, 10 years ago, it was like, what is cybersecurity? It was very abstract. Many directors, unless you were from the field, didn't know really what it is and why should we worry about it. Or it seems like something there, it's happening to other people. It's not us. We don't have important or interesting information or data. That's not true, as we know. Fast forward, there has been quite maturity in directors in terms of what cybersecurity is, how we defend against that. So such that, now and moving forward, the boards obviously have to continue doing training, what I call Cyber 101, but there's going to be a lot more emphasis is cyber as a risk. And how does, as I mentioned earlier, as we develop a business strategy, how do we fold into that the cyber strategy and cyber risk management? Because when you think about what's happening in the world and digitization of every aspect of our industry, every industry and every aspect of that industry, with digitization comes cyber risk, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, and your experience is really interesting because not only have you, and currently sit on public, private, nonprofit boards, but you've also run companies, right, as CEO. And so you've been observing the cybersecurity industry both as a participant and a user, which is really interesting. How have you seen the industry evolve over time, and how have you seen it evolve more towards the risk management side of things?
By the way, as a CEO, I was, our systems, the company I was CEO of, the systems were breached. And guess who came and knocked on our door and helped us? With FBI, actually.
Really?
Yes. So I have to say, well, that's a positive side of it, although I will tell you a little bit later about the fact that I want to see a lot more from the government. Now, what are the characteristics of cybersecurity? Look, it's a very, very interesting sector. I got introduced to it years ago, and I've always stayed one way or another in it. And in the last 7 years, in fact, more intensely than ever before. And I'm always fascinated. First, it has a large TAM. It has today in 2022, it's expected to be roughly almost 500 billion, 150 billion spending, of which majority of it is IT services. The growth as a total for this TAM is around 10%, but when you look at the software side, it will be a lot higher. You can just take some of the successful companies like CrowdStrike, and you see the ARR is growing 65 to 77% per quarter, so that gives you a sense. But what is interesting is it's pretty concentrated in some ways, because if you look at, for example, the top 35 highest value companies, these are obviously public companies, it's about 450 billion market cap, with 50% of that in the top 5, which tells you some level of concentration in terms of how much value sits in the top companies. Having said that, we probably, I know a lot of cybersecurity firms, but I don't know how many I can name, maybe 50, but there's probably 250, 350 cyber firms around the world that people can name. But there's, it's told that US alone has potentially 3,500 cyber firms.
Wow.
Some statistics say 2,000, others say 3,500. And roughly there should be another 3,500 or maybe more. So maybe around the world there's 10,000 cyber firms. So it's a lot of fragmentation. Even the value can be sitting on a few companies up there. So, so why do we have this fragmentation? Innovation. I mean, there's so much innovation happening in cyber, and innovation is happening because we're all very smart people and we like to innovate, but also because the dynamics of businesses are keep changing. We talked about digitization of industry. So as you keep transforming the businesses, as you go to cloud, as you do SaaS, you basically have new cyber issues. And therefore there are new companies coming up with these, what is the solution to these cyber risks? On one hand. On the other hand, you have nation states and very, very powerful and super smart hackers who also are innovating. So there's the innovation on top of innovation. And as a result, you have a situation where you have so many different things happening in the sector, both in response to new business models, new nation state threats, I say that because there are some of those nation states which are actually threatening private businesses and hackers. So as therefore you have like a lot happening all the time in the sector.
Yeah, there's a lot of fragmentation. There's a lot of noise. I know we've talked about that before, which makes it challenging for CISOs to prioritize and boards to prioritize what they should do. So an added component is this noise element. Can you talk a little bit about the issue of noise in the cybersecurity space as someone who does advise lots of different has advised cybersecurity companies, and talk a little bit about why making decisions for CISOs can be so difficult because of this?
Right. So exactly, as it's sort of continuation what I was saying, when there is so many things happening in the business model itself, right? At the same time, nation states are doing different things, and we're seeing it with this war. But by the way, this war forever has changed the picture of cybersecurity, because cybersecurity, well, I mean, nation state attacks have been around for a good while now, and there are some famous examples of them, public examples, and then there are like the ones which it's hush-hushed. But this is the first time that in actual physical war, we very obviously and very openly, the aggressor is saying, yeah, I am going to do cyber attack as well. And then you have seen private hacker groups have said, well, we're attacking, in support of Ukrainians, we're attacking Russians. And so it's a very interesting situation. Forever has changed the face of cybersecurity and the face of wars forever. But so back to the noise level. Yes, so the issue is a lot of things are happening, a lot of innovation in business models, in the way you use your mobile phone, in the way you use your email, remote work, which is like went off the roof in during pandemic. As a result, CISO and the team of security team have to be like kind of like little rabbits running after what's happening, And then what happened is, as areas like, attack surface management or compliance management, all these terminologies start to be used. And what happened, cybersecurity firms, small and large, sometimes misuse these terminologies. They say, oh, I can do attack surface management. When you really dig in, you realize, no, they don't. They do just very specific small piece of it, and they don't even do the management of it. It's more like a solution, to feel like a whole, like, it's just, as a result, it becomes confusing, even for someone like me. You really have to talk to people that's exactly what do you do. And then one of the questions I like to always ask is, what do you displace? Who do you displace? And if the company CEO tells me none, it's good and bad. It's bad because I'm like, I don't believe you. And it is good if it is truly a niche that they have found that no one ever has applied any solutions to. And but generally it means they're confused themselves as how they can serve the customer.
Yeah.
So you have all of this. So I think there's also a lot of overlapping solutions. You could say an endpoint solution provider, they can say, well, I do also threat management. I can also do detection and MDR, for example. Management of detection and response. But they just do a piece of it, not complete solution. So there's a lot of confusion. As a result, CISOs and their teams have to study quite a lot to decide what they would adopt next.
Yeah, and it's difficult for the CISO to not only prioritize and choose what gaps to fill and how to fill them, but also how to communicate that upwards to a CEO or board of directors. Hey, this is how we're using our funds most effectively. These are the risks that we're buying down. So kind of switching to the CISO reporting line, talking about frameworks and the CISO's interaction with the board. We at CyberSaint like to say that we help organizations standardize, centralize, and automate the cyber risk management process. CyberStrong helps organizations identify their gaps, mitigate risk, and communicate their cyber posture. Can you talk a little bit about why a solution like this is important for CISOs to leverage in light of all this noise and confusion in the market?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, look, I mean, the thing is, the compliance has been like a check mark, right? Today, it's basically questionnaire, and companies just do it. It's kind of a commodity versus actually being a differentiator for a business. They're like, oh my God, I have to say I'm compliant. And I think that's wrong because, in fact, the compliance shouldn't be like, oh yeah, I have this, I have that. Should be when a company pauses and they decide internally whether they are, in fact, have gaps in their cyber posture, if you like, and cyber solutions. Which is why I like CyberStrong, because I think with the automation that you have, you're enabling that. Because part of the issue is when you don't have automation, it's hard for a person to sit down. I mean, I'm sure you, like me, when you have to do questionnaires by hand, it's like we roll our eyes. We don't want to do it. So what do? We just look at what we've done last year. Has it happened to you? It has happened to me. I take questionnaire from last year and I just said, okay, let me just remember. Everything is no or yes or whatever. And that's the reality. So while in the world of cyber, 1 year is like a decade. You would have changed so much. So for me, it's very important. A solution like yours is very interesting and one which companies should really adopt. With that, I think really the government also has to play a better role and really requiring and regulating more disclosure, but also in a transparent and automated way. But also not to ask just a questionnaire to be filled out and sent in. So I think that governments can do a lot more to also find out what attacks have been there, communicate that to this sector, to this industry, actually the cybersecurity industry, but then also also potential customers, and then and obviously help as a whole that that this sector as a whole and its customers become more intelligent and more and be able to defend themselves better.
Yeah, and speaking of the regulators, so we talk a lot about frameworks and standards. That's really the backbone of the product. What recommendations would you give CISOs on how to present to the board, and maybe utilizing some of these frameworks, like the NIST cybersecurity framework, for example? Is that something that you would recommend that they do?
Sure. I mean, I think more interesting for me, using a company like CyberStrong and what you produce from your solution that I have seen, which I really like, it's much better than taking NIST framework and say, here's some checking mark, because NIST is kind of a check mark thing. And the other thing is all companies should have some level of dashboards or KPIs and report against that, quarter after quarter. and that has to be meaningful. That's why, again, using a solution like CyberStrong can be very powerful to be able to, sorry, something is, this is the problem when you do with computers, something flashed out. I had to close it. So that's why it's very important to have those dashboards based on solutions like yours. But that's what I like better. And then really the conversation around, so what breaches we saw or attempted breaches we saw in the last month or quarter, depending on, definitely every quarter at least, and how do we mitigate it against them? Which one were successful? How long did it take time to detect and time to remediation? Those are all very important set of metrics that I think boards need to understand and know of on a regular basis.
Do you have any examples of times where, or maybe just anecdotes of times where you've seen this done really well?
You're putting me on.
I'm curious.
Well, I mean, what I could say is one of my boards, I can't name it because, one of the things they always say, as soon as you say a company is very good, then all the hackers say, okay, I'm going to show that is not true. So they always tell me, we always say we shouldn't name which companies are the best. But yeah, I mean, I think, look, what I have seen is what I was mentioning, really evolution from 2013 of many companies that I've been on board or advised to, that they were very mature in their approach towards cyber. It was more firewall. I mean, it was like basically firewall, antivirus type of thing, to being quite mature now across the board and have different vendors. One of the things that perhaps it's a good time to say, even though we talked about, I really appreciate when CISOs and security teams do look for emerging companies and adopt them. Because we discussed earlier, there's so many things happening that it is really the emerging companies, the startups that say, oh, there is a problem here and I'm going to solve that problem. Yes, it is monoline, so there is mono product, but frequently those products are extremely powerful and work very well. And I think that it is very important for security teams to have, obviously, what I call a traditional, very strong local and traditional program with all the nuggets in place. But in addition, always look for those innovative companies and adopt them, even if it is proof of concept for some time, or it is, after proof of concept, they feel like they don't, because I think that's where you say, I'm done, I have my cyber defense, is when, when you're in trouble.
Definitely. Yeah. And, with all this innovation, with all this noise, fragmentation, but innovation, there's a lot of opportunities for consolidation, right? So switching over to talk a little bit about the M&A environment, because I know that's an area that you specialize in. Can you give a few examples of recent market activities that you feel are a good representation of the broader cybersecurity trends in the market right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe first I want to just let you know that this week was a hot week. We had at least three, I say three. SailPoint got bought by Thoma Bravo, a private equity. Vista bought an MDR company out of Plano. I think it was called Critical Start, Plano, Texas, from all places in the world. And also Vista sold, although it was announced, but the acquisition got completed of its Secure Link company to Imprevita. So in fact, M&A is quite strong in cybersecurity. Last year, it has grown up, I think, from 2020 by 300%, and it was almost 78 billion spending in 2021. Why? The reasons behind that is you basically have all this innovation happening, and And companies really, even very successful companies like Palo Alto need to kind of buy innovation at times. But you have different group of buyers. You have private equity that we gave a couple of examples. You have very large technology companies like Google bought this year Mandiant for 5.4 billion because they want to have very secure cloud. So they decided just to buy Mandiant to do that.
Yeah.
You have then, cyber companies buying, for example, Okta bought Auth0 for 6.5 billion because of some of the solutions they had that could complement theirs. And then you have large companies like Cisco for a while was not so much recently, but for a while they were buying tons of cybersecurity and trying to put end-to-end cybersecurity solution together. I would say, we've had less luck creating that just because of the dynamics we talked about earlier, just different forces, different business models, and huge amount of innovation. And it's hard to do huge amount of innovation in huge companies, usually, short of course, Apple and Google and Facebook and Microsoft.
What are your if you were looking into your crystal ball, what is your projection on what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years when it comes to the M&A environment in cyber?
I think it will stay as strong as before. As I mentioned, I gave you the statistics that in 21, it was 300% higher than 2020. My guess is we will see higher in 2022 even, because what is interesting is the belief in the sector is so high that you see companies like SailPoint or Proofpoint get bought for fairly hefty 35 to 55% over their share price and private because the belief is that you can create more value and then eventually these companies will come back to public markets. So I think that when you observe all of that, it's just the curve is just going higher and higher rather than flatten. I don't see any flattening anytime soon.
Yeah, me neither. It's a good space to be in. It's definitely a lot of fun. Cool. And now for kind of the final question here. Speaking to the audience, we have boards of directors, CEOs, CISOs, COOs, non-for-profits listening in today. What is one takeaway you want to give to the management teams of these organizations?
Okay, so do take cybersecurity seriously. I think that I have worked very hard with the companies I work with, either I've been board or advisor, to tell them, believe me, it is very important, because even the company says, I don't have any data of interest. I'm not healthcare. I'm not financial services. We saw very well with ransomware. It has nothing to do with the data you have or you don't have. It's all about, in that case, extortion of money. So I think that first advice is do care, do believe it's real. The risk is real. Do put that, and then do all these little things like multi-factor authentication. I mean, believe it or not, so many companies don't have it. Do, make sure your passwords are very hardened. Ask your employees have much longer passwords and hardened passwords. Do all those little things because they make a difference. Don't get on, tell your employees never get on public Wi-Fi. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, regarding the board, what I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of things. One is, I think it's very important to have a set of KPIs. Whatever you can start with, whatever you think is right, and then evolve them over time. Because just having those KPIs and reporting on them, it's a process that many companies are not used to for cyber. But make them as important as your financials, and consider cyber as your top 5 risk, and obviously spend enough time to do the risk management and get insurance.
Oh, yes, that too. But cyber is a business function. It's what we talk about all the time. And it's true. Cyber could never be more important than it is today. So, well, thank you, Homaira, for taking the time to talk to us today. If anyone has any questions, feel free to shoot it in the chat, and we'll get those questions answered. But other than that, I mean, it's been a really great time talking to you, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to speak with us.
Well, thank you. And I hope we can continue this dialogue another time.
Definitely. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.